Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I have a very special camera to share with you guys, and this camera right here, it's the Canon EOS 6D. Yes, it's been out for quite a while now, and it's actually over 10 years old if you think about it, and still really capable. It's been a very fun camera to use for me personally. I've taken it to so many places, and it has been through a lot of weather conditions. It's been through so many backpacks, so many scratches, has pretty much scratched all over the body, but thankfully that it's not really fully magnesium alloy body, so you can't really see the scratches as much as, let's say, on my 5D Mark III and my 1DXs and things like that. But it's still a very tough and durable camera, as well as a very fun and capable camera to use. And in this video, just like in any of my thought videos on the cameras, it's just going to be based on my user experience with this camera, why I recommend it, why I don't, the pros and the cons and things like that. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon EOS 6D, now this camera came out way back in 2012. I still remember all those predictions about the world was gonna end and everything, and on my personal life side, I was still pretty much at the end of my middle school towards the beginning of my high school life, and my photography and filmmaking business, I was still using the 5D Mark III as my main camera, well 5D Mark IIIs, and also 5D Mark II as the backup camera. And when Canon announced the 6D, I was very excited because I was so ready to just kind of get rid of my 5D Mark II and just upgrade my backup camera to just pretty much the similar or the same level as my 5D Mark III. But you know, there are actually some setbacks that kind of prevented me from actually using it, and I will also be discussing some of the downside of this camera in this video as well, why you might also not want to consider it that much, because there are some certain features in this camera that, you know, you might actually overlook, but to some of you, especially for portrait shooters or for shooters who generally use bright lenses, might want to kind of stay away from, especially shooting in the daylight hour, things like that. So yeah, in this video, I'll be dividing into 3 different sections as usual. One will be about the ergonomics, the usability, the operational side of things of this camera. Number 2 will be the image quality for both photography and filmmaking. Number 3 will be pretty much my conclusion, why I recommend this camera, why I don't, what I still think about it, and why it's still pretty much a really fun camera to use. So let's first start with number 1, which is the ergonomics, the operational side of things, the usability, things like that. So yeah, this camera feels really nice in hand. I remember the first time I tried this camera at the airport while waiting for my delayed flight. It was delayed by 4 hours. I spent literally 2 hours holding this camera at the shop, and it was really nice, and that's when I actually fell in love with the 6D. And it took me just about, well, at least a couple of years later to finally buy the 6D, simply because I really wanted to do a lot of things with the 6D. I really love the Wi-Fi feature. I really wanted to use the GPS feature. I love the color science, the color reproduction and everything, but I'll discuss that more in the image quality section. But yeah, I really wanted a lot of the features that this camera offers, especially that center focusing point, which can actually focus down to -3 EV. -3 EV doesn't sound like a lot, especially if you're coming down from cameras like this one, which is the R5, or this one, which is the R6. But for DSLRs back then, to be able to shoot in -3 EV, while to be able to focus at that low light condition, is actually very impressive. This was actually more effective and also more sensitive than the 5D Mark III even, and I was super excited to actually shoot in -3 EV environments, of course, because that would be a huge game changer, especially for wedding photography or for event photography or just anything that requires low light. And this camera just didn't disappoint, of course. And having only 11 AF points, it doesn't sound like a lot, especially if you're coming from even the 5D Mark III line, but you know, it's really nicely placed. It actually expands a little bit more than the rule of third, which is pretty much going to cover more than all the general purposes of photography or the general area that you want to actually focus on anyway. Now, of course, having a sensitive autofocusing points in here doesn't mean it's going to be super fast like the 1DX's kind of the autofocusing system, or the 7D line, or the 7D Mark II, things like that. It's not going to be that fast, but it is going to be very, very accurate, and it's just really nice to have such an accurate and also sensitive autofocusing system in this camera, especially at this price point. Not to mention that nowadays you can actually get it around 270 euros. I actually got this one for 275 euros. Now, of course, I do understand this depends on where you live, because, for example, if you buy it from Thailand, it's actually much lower than 270 euros. But if you buy it from the Scandinavian countries, on average, it's going to be over 300 euros. So I think I kind of got this one for just around in the middle price range wise. So yeah, but anyway, back to the usability and the ergonomics. This camera really has a lot of the button layout really nicely and logically laid out, and the buttons feels very tactile. Like even if you have gloves on, you know that you actually press those buttons. It's really nice. The only downside about this camera that I find is the buttons up here on the command up here. It's just one function. It's very similar to the 60D, 70D line of cameras, where it's pretty much only one functions, whereas with the 5D line of cameras and even the 50D, 40D line of cameras before the 60D was introduced, essentially, you have dual command per button, and I much prefer that. It's much quicker, whereas with this, sometimes you just have to access the menu or access the quick settings here, which, you know, can actually get your eye away from the viewfinder, thus could actually make you miss certain shots. That being said, if you just want to change your core settings, like your ISO, your aperture, your shutter speed, the core essential buttons and dials are still at your fingertips. So you still don't need to actually take your eyes off the viewfinder while trying to compose the image, and just still kind of look through and just adjust your settings from back here, from top here, and from these buttons right at your fingertips. So that's actually still very, very nice. But of course, if you want to access your white balance and some other settings, you might have to actually get into the screen here and actually either go into the menu or just through the quick settings. So yeah, just take it for what it is. It's still good, but could have been better. The card slot on this camera is very controversial, as many photographers want to have dual card slots, whereas this one is only one SD card, which is, to be honest, another reason why I didn't use or replace my 5D Mark II completely with this camera. Because if you use the 5D Mark III, which I was using at the time, it's always best to have the media that you trust the most, and I trusted CF cards over SD cards, and of course this being only an SD card slot is a huge downer for me, simply because the 5D Mark III and the 5D Mark II can actually share the cards, and I can always switch between the 5D Mark III and 5D Mark II depending on the circumstances and what I had to do at the time. So yeah, that just meant that the 60 at the time could only stay at home. Yeah. Anyway, now onto the next point, which is the battery life. The battery life on this camera is excellent. It takes the legendary LPE6 battery right here. Oh, I have the LPE6N actually. It's actually more powerful, well, a tiny bit more powerful and better efficiently managed with the power inside the battery itself. But anyway, you can use either or battery. Both of them will actually work with this camera, even though natively it's LPE6. But that battery is still really good in terms of giving you really powerful battery life in this camera, and being a camera that actually requires very little amount of battery, since it's a DSLR. Mainly it will just, you know, you have to look through your viewfinder and then just press the shutter, and then that's when the energy is consumed by raising the curtain and the mirror and storing the images, things like that. Oh, and also the focusing, of course. But yeah, it will just not really consume a lot of power, and it doesn't require a lot of power. Where it requires a lot of power is actually in video mode, where if you record like hours and hours of video, well, it's not going to be good for the battery because it doesn't really last that long. You might actually have to buy several batteries. But if you're actually having this camera stationary on a tripod anyway, it's good to buy one of those dummy batteries and just plug it in here. And on the side, there is actually kind of like a little hole, well, a rubber pad where you can just take the pad kind of out and then plug in the cable on the dummy battery so that you can actually record until the card is full, of course. So yeah, it's pretty good. And this camera is actually able to do tethering just like any Canon DSLRs or even modern mirrorless cameras. So you can actually plug this into like the EOS utility app, the EOS utility program on your computer and just tether shoot from there, or even Adobe Lightroom. And also if you use EOS utility, you can actually add other picture profiles into the camera. So let's say if you're shooting videos and you like some sort of flat profile, there are a lot of flat profile out there that you can actually download, whether paid or free, and you can actually transfer it to this camera via EOS utility app. So I remember shooting a lot of movies with my 5D Mark III, 5D Mark II with really flat cinematic profile that I've downloaded, and I just pretty much put those profiles onto my cameras via the EOS utility. You can actually do it with this, but because at the time I didn't really shoot a lot of, or actually any paid job with this camera because I had those cameras available, but I could have actually done that with this camera. It would actually have been the same process. So if you want to do that, you actually can, and the option is still there, so that's actually quite nice. This camera actually shoots at 4.5 frames per second. Now to a lot of you it might not sound like a lot, but I think it's actually more than enough to cover general purpose of photography, you know, whether if you're in street photography or portrait photography, or even if your portrait subject is kind of like moving in about just bit by bit, you still can cover that, of course. And the autofocusing system is definitely more than sensitive enough to just track basic portrait movement. Don't get me wrong, it's not as bad as the 5D Mark II. It's just still very nice, sensitive and accurate, so that's pretty good. And also it will also not have as much problem as the 5D Mark II when you're using the bright aperture lenses like the 85 1.2 or the 50 1.4, 50 1.2. It will be much more accurate than, let's say, the 5D Mark II, but it won't be as super snappy as, let's say, the 5D Mark III or the 1DX autofocusing system. So yeah, take it for what it is. It's still there. The buffer is actually pretty good on this camera, so you can actually shoot for a very long period of time. And the next point is actually the screen. Now I personally consider it as like a step backward from the 5D Mark III, simply because it's only 3 inches versus 3.2 inch on the 5D Mark III, but at least they managed to give us a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is definitely more efficient and more comfortable to actually judge your images or control or just see your video while you're actually recording. It's so much better aspect ratio to actually work with on the camera, but of course nowadays it's kind of standard to have a 3:2 kind of aspect ratio screen, of course. But the color accuracy on here is actually really good, even though sometimes it can be a little bit too warm, but the contrast and everything, the sharpness is actually pretty okay, especially for the price point and of course the age of the camera itself. Now another step backward in my opinion is also the fact that the screen protector here is actually plastic versus glass cover on the 5D Mark III and later the 5D Mark IV, things like that. It does make a huge difference when you're actually viewing the display in the bright sunlight. Of course, you will still be able to see the display, just that a little bit more flaring, a little bit more reflective with this kind of plastic cover, and also the screen being a little bit kind of further away from the plastic cover versus on the glass screen, where the screen is just pretty much laminated onto the glass. That really hugely reduces flaring and also reflection on the screen. But that's a very small point to make to some of you, but to many of you who shoot in direct sunlight, it could be a deal killer, for example. So yeah, just keep in mind for that. And also my next point is actually right next to the screen. It's actually this D-pad plus the wheel itself. I actually really love this wheel, to be honest with you, and for the fact that this camera doesn't have a lot of autofocusing points in the viewfinder to begin with, you don't really have to worry too much about not having the actual thumbstick over here or joystick. Of course, you might be complaining that, yeah, but David, what about reviewing the images? You have to scroll around with this D-pad and could be uncomfortable. Well, to be honest, to my surprise, this D-pad actually feels very comfortable. If you're coming from the 60D, for example, that D-pad is horrible, but for some reason they made the feeling of this D-pad a bit different from the 60D, that it actually feels more responsive and it's also smoother, yet not too smooth to actually rotate the wheel right here. And overall it actually just feels just nice, and it's also kind of quick when you're actually reviewing images and you just scroll through, and if you just want to like suddenly switch to the D-pad, it's actually also really quick. Oh, and just back to the viewfinder for just a bit. The viewfinder, I forgot to mention that it's actually only 97% view coverage, so there is the last 3% missing because it's not a full 100% coverage in the viewfinder. That being said, it's also not really a huge problem, even though to some people it might be a huge problem and could be a deal breaker. But to me personally, I find that for most discipline of photography, I can just pretty much work just fine, and it didn't really kind of get me any random images where I thought like, did I really take that image? No, it's really not that bad. It's 97%. You can just predict the last 3% by yourself, and if you're working with this camera for quite a while, you will be used to it, and you will just forget about the fact that, you know, the last 3% isn't there in the viewfinder. So yeah, just take it for what it is. It's still a great camera, and it's still quite a nice and bright viewfinder. So if you're working with, let's say, manual focus lenses, you will still be able to focus really nicely with your manual focus lenses. Oh, and one thing with Canon, this is a huge positive thing about most Canon DSLR bodies, is that if you have like a manual focus lens mounted in front of the camera, you can actually half press on the shutter, and when you move your focus ring, you will see which of the autofocusing points will illuminate, showing which part of the image is actually in focus, if in focus at all. So that's actually really good when you're using a lot of manual focus lenses. Of course, it doesn't really work the same way in video, but that is to be expected, especially with such an old sensor of the 6D. Whew. Anyway, now onto the side over here, we have ports, which seems very short, but also very just efficient and crucial. So on the side is where you'll find all the essential ports to your remote, your digital out, your USB, your mic, your HDMI, and it's just all very simple and just right there. I do not, however, like the fact that the mic port is actually way down at the bottom over here. It's just not logical to actually place it there. Maybe it would actually be nicer to swap with the remote, since the remote is actually usually hanging on the tripod anyway. So if you have the remote down here, it would actually have been much nicer, and of course you wouldn't have to stretch your microphone port, well, cable all the way down to the bottom of the camera. So that's just a little nitpick on my side. So yeah, that's it about the ports. I personally don't have a lot to complain about in terms of the ports, but I do know a lot of people who complain that this camera doesn't have the headphone jack. That being said, the past few years I saw a lot of hack that a lot of people bought a certain HDMI adapter with the headphone jack that they can just monitor their audio, or just plug in the HDMI with the audio jack port that they can actually just hear the audio what the camera is actually recording. I'm talking about video. In my opinion, this camera really has good preamp built into the board, in my opinion, simply because, you know, way back when I was still using this to film some sort of like school projects, things like that, I remember recording video, well, interview videos, even with my external audio recorder, with you know, like the boom mic and the recorder, things like that. And there were times when I was actually too lazy to synchronize the audio with the camera's audio, so I just ended up using the camera's built-in audio, well, microphone into the amplifier, well, the preamp into the camera. And I remember no one really thought that the audio quality was bad. And to be honest, when you just, you know, do a bit of sound correction and also add some background music, things like that, the audio just sounds perfectly fine, and you don't really hear a lot of fuzz or hiss or anything. And yeah, it's just a pretty good preamp, and there's just decent amount of bass in there to give your voice or the talent's voice a bit of kind of character in their voice, or a bit of depth into their voice, which actually is quite nice. So if you're using this camera for video, especially you wanting to use the preamp in this camera, even if you have an external microphone plugged into the camera's preamp, I think you will actually get away with it quite fine if you just want to be quick and, yeah, lazy like me. So yeah, that's about that. Now over to the mode dial. Now when it came out, A lot of people really complain about why did it have to have a mode dial lock up here. It's just really frustrating, you know, why? Most people are not going to knock it. But if you're a type of people who uses at least 2 cameras, you will know that having a lock here is like a godsend, simply because, you know, you could be swinging your camera around and the mode dial just gets knocked very easily. So I personally really appreciate having a mode dial lock up here. And the next point that I would like to make is actually the shutter speed. The shutter speed on this camera is personally a huge deal breaker for me that prevented me from actually replacing my 5D Mark II in the very first place, which it only goes up to 4,000th of a second. To a lot of people, this is not a huge deal, but to me, this is a really huge deal, especially someone who likes to use the f1.2 lenses, f1.4 lenses. And if I would have to take portraits, you know, during like a bright sunny daylight condition, having the 8,000th of a second on standard DSLRs would be much more helpful. Of course, in some cases, even 8,000th of a second is not enough. But, you know, like, at least it gives you even more room to recover that highlight back in post, whereas with 4,000th of a second, it's just really a total deal breaker for me personally. But of course, if you live in like an area where sunlight doesn't reach you a lot or very often throughout the year and you're using f1.2 lenses, then yeah, you'll definitely get by with the 4,000th of a second shutter limit. And also you can just be asking like, David, you could actually have used the ND filter, but ND filters pose a lot of inconvenience, you know, and I just like to have my lenses free of ND filters at all times and only put them when I really need ND filters. Because, you know, adding another glass in front is just adding another procedure, and you have to remember that. And also adding another glass in front of the lens also kind of lower the performance of the actual optics as well as the autofocusing system just by a tad. So yeah, I wasn't really comfortable as to always put on the ND filter. So for me, 4,000th of a second shutter speed is kind of a deal breaker at the time. And yeah, it just really prevented me from actually replacing my 5D Mark II at the end of the day from the beginning. So yeah, and one last point before going into the image quality, which is the Wi-Fi and the GPS. Now the Wi-Fi feature itself is really nice. You can actually transfer your images from this camera to your phone very easily, but you can also tether your camera to your mobile devices very easily as well, and you can just see what the camera is seeing, take the video or take the photo, or just wirelessly control your camera from your mobile devices, and that was actually quite convenient. Now of course there is some sort of lag when wirelessly tethering this camera with your mobile devices, just like a few seconds lag, and it's not really as fast or responsive as, let's say, with the more modern cameras, let's say even the 70D or the R5 and the R6 behind me. If you're not really tethering a lot, this is not a huge issue, of course, but you know, it's still a really nice feature that allows you to really see and monitor what the camera is seeing and kind of direct the camera or just adjust the camera in a certain way. This can also be very helpful if you're just filming yourself like this, or if you're just, you know, going to be operating the camera from the off-site location. You can just really monitor it. So for example, if you're like capturing certain projects or certain experiments where you are not allowed to be in a room, but your camera can be in the room just to record your results, things like that, then you can just put the camera in the room and monitor the live feed from outside the room. So yeah, it's pretty fun. It's really nice to get experimental with it as well, and overall it's pretty nice. But on the other hand, with GPS, originally I was really excited about the GPS system, the feature itself. I really was playing around with the GPS all the time, and it was also, to be honest, one of the reasons why I really wanted to get the 6D. And also I was kind of like using iPhoto to also categorize my photos at the time. Nowadays you don't have iPhotos anymore, but anyway, it would also like to geolocate geotag your images and put them on the map for you and things like that. And it was just some sort of fun feature that I just, you know, like to have. That being said, I found out the hard way that it was another way to really drain down your battery life, because it seems like it's kind of like its own module inside the camera, in the way that once you enable it in the menu, just by powering off the camera doesn't mean you actually turn off the GPS. The GPS will still be running behind the scenes even though the camera is powered off. Now, from the engineering point of view, this is very efficient, because if you're one of those photographers who just happen to turn on and off the camera, you know, every few minutes or every few hours, things like that, it's just more efficient if the GPS system were to always be connected with the satellite, so it doesn't have to re-establish the connection and everything, and therefore also saves battery life in that kind of situations. But if you're one of those people who just, you know, want to use GPS for fun and forget once in a while, or actually for the most part, to turn off your GPS, you know, the battery will just keep on draining down and down and down, and the next time you pick up your camera, the battery could just be flat. So that is somewhat of an inconvenience, but also convenient feature in disguise as well. So yeah, it's a fun feature, but it's also a feature to really be careful when it comes to battery life. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Now over to the image quality. The image quality on this camera, I really love it so much. I love the color reproduction. I love the styling of this camera, the color rendition, the color depth and everything. Of course, there are the downsides, like in low light, you can't go as high as, let's say, the 5D Mark III, but to be honest, in most scenarios, I really have no complaints when it comes to low light performance with this camera. You can comfortably use it up to, let's say, 1600 professionally, and I wouldn't go higher than 3200 for a personal project. Of course, with the resolution, and if you're only posting on social media, you can maybe go a little bit higher and use the, well, trade in some of the resolution for the denoising feature and have a cleaner image. So there is that. But for the most part, yeah, it's really a great camera, and low light is great. The color reproduction, the contrast control is great. I love the skin tones and the color reproduction of the skin tones, as well as the rendition of it coming out of this camera. Regardless of like complex skin tones or not, this camera is just able to render those skin tones really nicely and smoothly as well. Though of course not too smooth like one of those beautify kind of mode, but it's just in a very natural, smooth way that it renders all these colors, and the skin textures and everything is just really nice. I think that this is kind of like a sweet spot, you know? And it's also kind of like a sweet spot resolution for taking portraits as well, in my opinion, because it doesn't really kind of record too much of the unwanted skin details, for example, the wrinkles, certain scars, things like that. So with this camera, I think it's also a great resolution to just kind of work with when it comes to portraits or anything to do with skin work in general. But also if you're doing a lot of travel photography and also a lot of landscape photography, this camera is really good at rendering all the greenery tones as well as that gritty kind of tones from the cityscape photography. So it's really nice, and it's also really great in low light, rendering between highlights and shadows. It's, yeah, I can't say a lot of bad things about this camera. The only bad things I can really say from this camera, well, about this camera, is the moire and aliasing. Even back then, it wasn't really that good. It's much better than the 5D Mark II, don't get me wrong, but it's far behind the 5D Mark III. And of course, if you don't shoot a lot of subjects where there are a lot of fine patterns, you can just get away with moire and aliasing. But if you shoot a lot of subjects with a lot of complicated patterns, or just a lot of patterns in general, you will run into moire and aliasing. But cutting that away, I think you will be happy and pleased with the contrast, the color rendition, the color depth, and pretty much the color reproduction of this camera. The low light, of course, it's not the most amazing low light camera in the world, but for the price point and of course for the age, it's still a very good low light camera that you still even able to actually take it to, let's say, wedding ceremonies and photograph certain events, things like that. So yeah, if I have done it in the past perfectly fine, I think you will be able to deliver really great images even in low light situations with this camera perfectly fine. And of course, having that -3 EV autofocusing system central point in here will actually get your job done a lot easier. And even if you mount it with the 85 1.2, it will still be a very nice, dreamy camera to work with. Whew. Now over to the video side of things. It's also very similar on the video side of things, but because of the more compressed kind of file that you get from the video side of things on this camera, you really have to make sure that the color is really the color that you want, because you can't really tweak a lot later in post. And also, you have to make sure that the exposure is more or less what you want it to be, because again, you can't really tweak it later in post as well. But straight out of the camera, I think you will love the actual contrast, the color signs, and the color rendition as well. Albeit the dynamic range in video is not really great, and it's kind of bad compared to modern day standards. But again, if you download like a flat profile and just kind of transfer it onto this camera, I have a video actually about how to do that, though with a different Canon camera, but it's essentially the same. I'll link it somewhere up on one of the corners. But yeah, you can essentially just download any flat profile into this camera and just have a much flatter profile to work with. That being said, even with a flat profile, please do be careful that, you know, you're not working in super extreme contrasty environments, because it will also bring out a lot of noise in the shadow area. So just be careful of that. Because when I first used the flat profile on my 5D Mark III, I wasn't aware of that, and I was using it in so many contrasty situations that even on the 5D Mark III, there were a lot of noise present in the image, and well, in the video image. So just be careful of that. Otherwise, if you're not using it to the extreme, this is still a very good video feature. And if you do color correct it in post, as well as do a bit of sharpening later in post, it will still deliver really great results. So overall, for video in general, I think that this camera will still produce really great results if you know what you're doing, and if you can set most of the parameter correctly to as much as accurate as how you want it as a final output as possible. So yeah, just take it for what it is, and you will be able to actually come home with really nice results at the end of the day. It doesn't have autofocusing system, just keep that in mind, but it is still a good video camera. So yeah, now over onto my conclusion. I know it's been a very long video. Thank you for actually listening this far, if you're actually still listening. But it's overall a very nice camera, and I think it's a camera that it's a master of none, but it's like a jack of all trade. And it's just a very capable camera, whether if you're doing street photography, doing portrait photography, doing simple filmmaking. Sure, it doesn't have the latest and greatest feature out there, but the quality that this camera outputs is still great. And not to mention, this camera is still under 300 euros. Yes, I got it for 275 euros. But I think depending on the condition and the region you live in, you can get it even much lower or a little bit higher than that price range. And for that price range, it is still a very nice DSLR to use. Not to mention, the EF mount really offers you a lot of opportunity for getting different lenses, therefore getting different perspective as well. And to get into a full frame camera that has Wi-Fi, wireless tethering, or even like just normal tethering into the camera with really nice color rendition, really nice color reproduction, really nice skin tones, is just like a bargain at this point. And you know, we've come really a long way with technology, that nowadays you can really just start photography with just this amount of money, because back then it's just a lot of money to just get into full frame with at least decent colors, you know. And nowadays with this color signs and also with the performance, sure, 4.5 frames per second might not sound a lot again, but for most scenarios it is more than enough in my opinion. So yeah. Whew. That Wi-Fi feature and also the GPS feature is also a great tool to have, especially if you're doing event photography, especially if you're doing landscape photography, cityscapes, or creating any sort of personal blogs as well. There are just great features to have. And yeah, at the end of the day, you will be able to really come home with a lot of memorable images, as well as a lot of nice creations that you've captured with this camera, simply because it is still a rugged and tough camera. It went through harsh rain, harsh weather condition, it lived through the heat wave, it went through really cold temperature operation. Actually, right now it's kind of like stormy here where I live, and the temperature is sub-zero and it's really freezing. Many of my cameras struggle to actually work. Well, many of my old cameras are actually struggling to work in this temperature, but this camera is still going very strong, and it's just a testament to how tough this camera was built and designed and produced, of course. And even though it's not fully magnesium alloy, it is still a very tough camera. And it's just also a very light and compact camera in general. It was one of the smallest DSLR, well, full-frame DSLR that was actually introduced. So yeah, even for today, it's actually still quite light and portable to take with you. And yeah, you can just take it through so many places and come back with so many memories and great image results with this camera. And it's just a really fun camera to use at the end of the day. And even though it's a small form factor camera, it is still balanced enough to use bigger lenses like the 70-200 f2.8 or the 85 1.2, things like that. It would still feel quite balanced with this camera. And of course, just because it's a smaller camera, it doesn't mean that bigger lenses will always protrude down and not really be balanced when it comes to this part, because even with this lens, it's still fairly kind of balanced and equal, so it's quite nice. But of course, with the 70-200, it will be kind of, you know, protruding downwards a little bit. That is to be expected. It's such a huge lens, the f2.8 version, but the f4 version is of course very small. But yeah, those were pretty much all of my main points. I still have some more points in my head, but this video is just getting really long and I would just like to end it here. And if you have any questions though, please leave them down in the comment section below. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. It's mine, and you can just feel free to just click and download. The link is down in the description section below. Just click and download. I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. Yeah, but yeah, otherwise, thank you very much for listening to me this long. It's been a very long video. I think it's one of the longest I've ever made so far. And yeah, thank you all as well for supporting my channel and also for watching my videos. It's been a pleasure, and I will continue to make more videos as well. And thank you very much again for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.